welcome to DCF Investigations. Picture a landscape that is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. The Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, sit at the very tip of Cape Cod, a curled finger of land stretching out into the Atlantic Ocean. In the summer, it is a haven of sun-bleached sand, scrub pine, and the roar of the surf. It is a place where tourists flock to escape the heat of the city, where artists go to capture the light, and where the solitude of nature offers a reprieve from the modern world. But on a humid day in July of 1974, that solitude was shattered by a discovery so gruesome, so perplexing, that it would haunt the region for nearly half a century. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about identity, about the erasure of a human life, and about the relentless march of science that finally, against all odds, gave a name to the Lady of the Dunes. To understand the gravity of this case, we must first transport ourselves back to the summer of 1974. The United States was in turmoil. The Watergate scandal was reaching its fever pitch, with President Nixon on the verge of resignation. The Vietnam War was winding down, leaving a scar on the national psyche. In Provincetown, however, the vibe was different. It was a bohemian enclave, a safe harbor for the LGBTQ community, and a summer playground for families. It was a place where people went to disappear for a weekend or for a summer. But someone had come there to make sure another person disappeared forever. On July 26, 1974, a 12-year-old girl named Sandra Lee was walking her dog through the dunes about a mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station. It was a typical summer activity, the kind of innocent exploration that defines childhood vacations. The dog, however, became agitated. It began barking incessantly at something concealed within the brush and the scrub oaks that cling to the sandy soil. Sandra, curious and unsuspecting, followed the dog's gaze. There, amidst the insects and the dune grass, lay the decomposing body of a woman. The scene that greeted the authorities was nightmarish. The woman was lying face down on a beach towel, as if she had simply fallen asleep while sunbathing. But the details revealed a violence that was cold, calculated, and deeply personal. Under her head, there were Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana folded roughly. She was naked, her body exposed to the elements and the insects. The level of decomposition suggested she had been there for perhaps 10 days to 3 weeks, placing her death somewhere in early to mid-July. But it was what was missing that chilled the blood of the investigators. The killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent identification. Both of the victims' hands had been severed at the wrists and removed from the scene. They were never found. Even more disturbing, her head had been nearly severed from her body, suggesting a brutal attempt at decapitation, and her teeth had been pulled out. This was not a crime of sudden passion, where a killer flees in panic. This was a disposal. The removal of hands to eliminate fingerprints and the removal of teeth to prevent dental identification pointed to a perpetrator who knew exactly how police investigations worked. This was a killer who wanted this woman to be a ghost. For decades, she was known only as the Lady of the Dunes. Her description was circulated endlessly. She was estimated to be between 25 and 40 years old. She had long auburn or reddish blonde hair that had been pulled back into a ponytail with a sparkly, gold-flecked elastic band. She was athletic, with a build that suggested she might have been a dancer or gymnast. Her toenails were painted pink, these small, human details. The ponytail holder, the nail polish, were the only things that connected her to a life, a personality, a history. But for 48 years, they were not enough to give her a name. The initial investigation was a masterclass in frustration. The Provincetown police, led by Chief James Meads, were a small force used to dealing with traffic violations and disorderly conduct, not gruesome mutilations. They combed the dunes on their hands and knees. They sifted through thousands of cubic yards of sand, looking for the missing hands, the teeth, or a weapon. They found nothing. There were no footprints, as the shifting sands and the wind had wiped the slate clean. There were no witnesses who had seen a struggle. The isolation of the dunes, the very thing that made them beautiful, had provided the perfect cover for murder. In the weeks and months that followed, the police chased down every lead, no matter how tenuous. They checked missing persons reports from across the country. They looked into every woman who had failed to return home from a summer vacation. They published composite sketches in newspapers from Boston to San Francisco. In October of 1974, the body was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery in Provincetown, with a headstone that read simply, "Unidentified female body found Race Point Dunes, July 26, 1974. But the case did not die. It went cold, but it never left the minds of the investigators or the community. Over the years, the Lady of the Dunes became a part of local folklore, a ghost story told around campfires. But in the world of true crime and cold case investigations, she remained a priority. As forensic science advanced, so did the attempts to identify her. The body was exhumed multiple times, first in 1980, then again in 2000, and finally in 2013. Each exhumation was a desperate bid to utilize new technology. In 1980, they hoped for better facial reconstruction. By 2000, they were hoping for DNA. The DNA profile obtained was mitochondrial, meaning it could trace maternal lineage. But without a comparison sample, it was just a string of data. They needed a name to compare it to. This is where the investigation splintered into a myriad of theories, suspects, and rabbit holes that captivated the public for decades. We need to examine these theories because they paint a picture of the era and the immense difficulty of solving a crime before the digital age. One of the most persistent and sensational theories involved one of America's most notorious gangsters, James Whitey Bulger. Bulger was the leader of the Winter Hill Gang in Boston, a ruthless crime syndicate. He was known to frequent Provincetown in the Cape. But more specifically, Bulger had a known modus operandi that uncomfortably matched the Lady of the Dunes case. He was known to remove the teeth of his victims to hinder identification. There were rumors, whispered in the back rooms of Boston bars, that the woman in the dunes might have been a girlfriend or an associate who knew too much. However, despite the compelling narrative, no concrete evidence ever linked Bulger to the crime. He was a convenient boogeyman, and while he was certainly capable of such brutality, the timeline and the specifics never quite aligned perfectly. Then there was the theory of Haddon Clark. Clark was a drifter and a convicted murderer, a man whose mental instability was as terrifying as his crimes. From prison, Clark sent cryptic letters and drawings suggesting he was responsible for the Lady of the Dunes. He claimed to have killed a woman on Cape Cod. He even led investigators on a search for buried evidence. But like the shifting sands of the dunes, his stories were unstable. Clark was a serial confessor, a man who sought notoriety and attention. While he was a monster in his own right, investigators eventually concluded that his confession was likely a fabrication, a way to toy with the authorities and stroke his own ego. Perhaps the most bizarre and fascinating theory emerged from the world of cinema. In 2015, the son of horror author Stephen King, Joe Hill, proposed a theory that went viral. He had been watching the classic 1975 film Jaws, which was filmed on nearby Martha's Vineyard during the summer of 1974. In a crowd scene, Hill spotted a female extra wearing a blue bandana and jeans, strikingly similar to the clothing found with the Lady of the Dunes. The resemblance was uncanny. Could the victim have been an extra on the set of Jaws who wandered off or met foul play later? It was a tantalizing idea. It connected a legendary unsolved mystery with a legendary film. Investigators actually looked into it, trying to track down the casting records for extras. But Jaws had employed thousands of locals and drifters as extras, and records from 1974 were incomplete at best. While it remains a fascinating pop culture footnote, it brought them no closer to her name. The years turned into decades. The detectives who originally worked the case retired and passed away. Chief Meads, who had taken the case so personally, died without knowing who she was. The Lady of the Dunes seemed destined to remain a mystery forever, a symbol of the unknown dead. But the world was changing. The golden age of forensic genetic genealogy was dawning. This is the technology that caught the Golden State Killer. It involves taking a DNA profile and uploading it to public genealogy databases to find distant relatives, third cousins, great-aunts, and then building a family tree backward and forward until it leads to the victim. It is painstaking work. It requires brilliant genealogists and detectives working in tandem. In 2026, nearly 50 years after the discovery of the body, the FBI and local authorities decided to try this method one last time. They partnered with Othram, a private lab specializing in forensic genealogy for cold cases. The skeletal remains, which had been degraded by time and the acidic soil of the dunes, were subjected to advanced sequencing. They managed to build a comprehensive DNA profile. Then, the genealogists went to work. They began tracing the branches of a family tree that had been severed half a century ago. They found connections in Tennessee. They narrowed it down to a specific family line. And finally, on October 31st, 2022, the FBI stood before a podium and announced to the world that the Lady of the Dunes had a name. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. Ruth was born in Tennessee in 1936. She was 37 years old when she died. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter. She was not just a body in the dunes. She was a woman who loved to cook, who had a beautiful singing voice, and who had a family that loved her. The revelation was bittersweet. For her family, it was the end of a lifelong, agonizing question. They had thought she had simply run away, started a new life, and chosen to leave them behind. They had waited for letters that never came. To learn that she had been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave for 50 years was a devastating blow. But it was also the truth. But the identification of Ruth Marie Terry was only half the battle. Now that they knew who she was, the question shifted from who is she to who killed her. And as investigators looked into Ruth's life in 1974, a dark and terrifying figure emerged from the shadows. Ruth Marie Terry had left Tennessee and moved to California. In the months leading up to her death, She had married a man in Reno, Nevada. That man's name was Guy Muldavin. Guy Muldavin is a name that should send shivers down your spine. If you research the history of true crime, you will find few individuals as slippery, as manipulative, and as potentially deadly as Muldavin. He was an antique dealer, a smooth talker, a man who could charm his way into anyone's life. But everywhere he went, silence and death followed. To understand the danger Ruth was in, we have to look at Muldavin's history, specifically an incident in Seattle in 1960, 14 years before Ruth's murder. At that time, Muldavin was living with his wife, Manzanita Muldavin, and her 18-year-old daughter, Dolores. He was known in the bohemian circles of Seattle as a charismatic intellectual, a man who dealt in rare artifacts. But in July of 1960, Manzanita and Dolores vanished. When friends and family asked where they were, Muldavin had a ready answer. He claimed that Manzanita had left him and taken her daughter with her. He played the part of the grieving, abandoned husband perfectly. He even sold off their furniture and belongings, claiming he was clearing out the house to move on. Eventually, he left Seattle and disappeared. It wasn't until later that the new owners of the home made a gruesome discovery. While cleaning out the septic tank on the property, they found human remains. It was Manzanita and Dolores. They had been dismembered. The brutality of the crime shocked the Pacific Northwest. Police launched a nationwide manhunt for Guy Muldavin. They eventually caught up with him in New York City. But here is where the legal system of 1960 failed spectacularly. The forensic technology of the time could not definitively prove that the remains in the septic tank were the victims, nor could they prove Muldavin killed them, although the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. He was never convicted of the murders. Instead, he was convicted of flight to avoid giving testimony and served a short sentence. He walked free. He was a man who had likely butchered 2 women, and he was back on the streets, free to reinvent himself. And reinvent himself he did. He changed his name. He moved around. He eventually met Ruth Marie Terry. They were married on February 16, 1974, in a small chapel in Reno. Ruth, by all accounts, was smitten. She told her family she was happy. She brought this new man to meet them in Tennessee. But her family had a bad feeling about him. They described him as strange, overly possessive, and aloof. They didn't know his history, but their instincts were screaming that something was wrong. In the summer of 1974, Ruth and Muldavin went on a trip. They traveled to the northeast, eventually landing in Provincetown. We can only imagine the final days of Ruth's life. Did she discover who he really was? Did she threaten to leave him? Or was she simply the next victim in a cycle of violence that Muldavin had been perpetrating for decades? The parallels between the Seattle murders and the Provincetown murder are chilling. In both cases, the victims were women close to him. In both cases, there was an attempt to obscure identity through dismemberment or mutilation. In Seattle, he used the septic tank to hide the remains. In Provincetown, he used the vast, shifting dunes and the removal of hands and teeth. It was the signature of a man who viewed human beings as problems to be disposed of, objects to be broken down and erased. After Ruth's death, Muldavin returned to his life. He told people that Ruth had left him, just as he had said about Manzanita 14 years prior. He continued to live, to work, to age. He moved to California and lived a quiet life. He He died in 2002 at the age of 78. He took his secrets to the grave. He was never charged with Ruth's murder during his lifetime because no one knew the Lady of the Dunes was his wife. When the FBI identified Ruth in 2022, they immediately looked for her husband. They discovered that Guy Muldavin was long dead. There would be no arrest. There would be no trial. There would be no moment where he stood before a judge and answered for his crimes. This is the tragedy of cold cases solved too late. Justice, in the legal sense, is denied. However, we must consider a different kind of justice. For nearly 50 years, Guy Muldavin thought he had gotten away with it. He thought he had successfully erased Ruth Marie Terry from the earth. He thought he was smarter than the police, smarter than the scientists. But he was wrong. He could not stop the march of technology. He could not stop the persistence of those who care about the unidentified. By identifying Ruth, investigators stripped Muldavin of his final victory. He did not erase her. She is remembered. Her name is spoken. Her face is known. He is revealed for the monster he was, not the charming antique dealer he pretended to be. The investigation into the Lady of the Dunes officially remains open in the sense that prosecutors rarely close a file without a conviction or the death of the suspect being officially ruled as the cause for closure. But for all intents and purposes, the authorities have stated that Guy Muldavin is the prime suspect, the only suspect. The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. He was her husband. He was with her at the time she vanished. He had a history of dismembering women. He lied about her disappearance. The puzzle pieces, scattered for half a century, have finally clicked into place to reveal a portrait of domestic terror. We must also reflect on the era in which this happened. The 1970s were a time when it was incredibly easy to disappear. There were no cell phones, no digital banking trails, no centralized databases connecting police departments across state lines. A man like Muldavin could kill in Seattle, serve a short time, move to California, marry in Nevada, kill in Massachusetts, and return to California without any alarm bells ringing in a computer system. He exploited the cracks in society. He preyed on the trust of women and the blindness of the system. The story of Ruth Marie Terry is a reminder of the thousands of unidentified bodies that still lie in unmarked graves across the country. Each one of them is a Ruth. Each one has a name, a family, a story. The science that identified her, forensic genetic genealogy, is the greatest tool justice has ever been given. It is currently solving cases that were thought to be impossible. It is bringing names back to the nameless. As we look back on the dunes of Provincetown today, the scenery hasn't changed much. The wind still whips through the scrub pine. The waves still crash against the shore. But the ghost story is over. The Lady of the Dunes is no longer a myth. She is Ruth Marie Terry. She was a daughter of Tennessee. She was a victim of a serial predator. And finally, after 48 years of silence, she has been heard. This case serves as a grim testament to the fact that while evil may thrive in the shadows for a season or even a lifetime, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, much like the shifting sands of the Cape that eventually give up their secrets. Muldavin may have escaped a prison cell, but he could not escape history. His legacy is now permanently stained with the blood of the women he tried to erase. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of America's most haunting mysteries. At DCF Investigations, We believe that every victim deserves a name and every story deserves to be told. The case of the Lady of the Dunes challenges us to remember that behind every gruesome headline is a human life cut short. We want to hear from you. Do you believe that justice can truly be served when the perpetrator is already deceased? Or does the identification of the victim provide enough closure? And what do you make of the fact that Muldavin was allowed to walk free after the Seattle discovery in 1960? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay observant, stay safe, and keep seeking the truth.